Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out for the planning board meeting on July 12th. Can we start with a roll call, Noreen?
Yes. Maybe not. I didn't want to start. Anthony Vaccaro is absent. Lisa McQuaid?
Here.
Rich Triano?
Here.
Bonnie Franson is running late. James McKnight is not here. Jason Sorinsky?
Present.
Jeff Manson?
Here.
Okay, Jeff is acting as chair until Bonnie arrives.
If I can ask everyone to arise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Just like to take a moment to point out the fire exits. Main fire exit is at the rear of the room here. There's fire exits behind us here.
Down the long hall.
And down the long hall. Thank you. Our first project that we're going to be looking at tonight is the Bavacqua subdivision.
They can come up to the table, please.
If you can please come up to the table.
Not here.
Not
Not here?
Um,
Well, that's even quicker. So we will
all
move
right.
on.
Okay. Our next project is a returning project, the Scunamunk subdivision.
I feel like I gotta hop the line pass. You know? Good evening, everyone. My name is John Queenan from Lankentelli Engineering, engineer for the applicant. As you may recall, we were before you a few months ago with a subdivision of a property located at 262 Scunamunk Road. It's an existing property, 6.1 acres in size. It is located in the RR10 zoning district. And when we came before you at the last time, we had just picked up, this application has been around for quite some time. It got caught in the moratorium, and now it's back, and we had come before you, I believe it was in March, if I'm correct, with a layout of an 11-lot subdivision. So we're in the process right now of preparing what we call the yield, based on your new zoning code, the yield plan, the lot yield, and the conventional and the resource. So what we provided to you for this submission is a few things. One, in the packet, you'll see the multi-sheet packet plan set. The first sheet is the existing conditions, so it's basically your survey with the resource analysis per your code. So it has trees that are greater than 8 inches in diameter. It has the steep slopes, which are the ones shaded in gray, and it has any existing easements on the property, as well as any stone walls that were located. So this property is, again, as I said, 6 acres in size. There are no wetlands on the property. There is an existing residential dwelling that has a driveway from Scunamunk Road up. The dwelling sits just maybe slightly off center of the property. You'll see on the survey, you'll see it says dwelling. So based on that, on the right-hand side of the map, we've given you a summary of your resources per your section 5721 of the zoning code. So that if you open up the plan fully, you'll see it on the right-hand side. So we've outlined your steep slopes, which are greater than 30%. We've indicated that there's no freshwater, wetlands, DEC, or federal. There are no 100-year floodplains. The property is not listed on historic preservation. It is not an agricultural property for farms. There is no significant scenic viewshed or an overlay district for viewshed. There is no public recreational resources on the property. Habitats for endangered threatened species, the EAF did trigger the Indiana bat and the northern long-eared bat, which is pretty much common for the entire area. We didn't find any unique or unusual landforms or geological formations, and there are no existing trails, bikeways, or hiking on this property. So based on all that and combining all that together, the second sheet of this plan set is what we're calling the yield plan, which is based on the SR10 zoning. And this yield plan was compromised with the proposed road layout in the loop fashion and it consists of 11 lots. And you'll see we have graded the entire property, and we've done bulk table requirements demonstrating that each of these lots are a buildable lot. Per the comments that we received at the March meeting, we did do the road grades. We made sure that they met the town specifications. And that's the third sheet of this plan set is just a road profile, just demonstrating that, the access that we propose is viable. We also did grade out the lots to ensure that access to each of the proposed building footprints was viable, and driveway connections. We also did investigate sanitary sewer service, which we are going to do an extension of Orange County Sewer to Orange County Sewer District number 1, which is shown. It'll come through some private lands, but we are pursuing that as well, and that is a viable connection. These lots would be serviced by private wells. There is no municipal water in this area. So that leads us to this point. So it's our understanding that we have shown a conventional yield plan of 11 lots. Now, sitting down with my applicant, he has decided to pursue a smaller subdivision is what he would like the board to consider pursuing, which is the single sheet, not in the set. And it is actually a 6-lot subdivision with a very similar layout. Now, the zoning code provisions indicate that you do the yield plan, and then the board discusses areas potentially for conservation, and then we form a cluster plan. What the applicant would like to do is, he would like to do 6 lots. He wants slightly larger lots. This is the number that he wants. He wants privacy. So in turn, we're kind of proposing to do this a little in reverse. We've proven to you that we can get 11 lots on the yield. Our cluster, per se, would be this 6-lot layout. So in terms of this, what we've done was, the applicant still would like a loop road, and the center of the loop, well, all the areas that you see hatched, kind of with that cross hatching, those would be the areas that would be open space or deed restricted for forever green or no development. So the intent was that you would come up the proposed road. The center of the proposed road would be left green. They would like to do some plantings in there and have a gazebo, maybe a play area in there, but leave that open so that when you enter into the subdivision, you're really entering into, you're going to see green, open space, and then loop around. And then the back of lot number 1, that's over to your left, and all along the perimeter would be that deed restricted area open space. We tried to kind of mimic where we thought clusters of the trees were in order to potentially, save those. And that's really where the point we're at tonight, is to go over this layout with you and see if you have any other areas of potential conservation or some different layout that you'd like to see, because the applicant is really, he's itching to go, and I'd like to start to do some final design work, but I need to know kind of the layout before we do that. So that's where we're at. And I'll go over to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll give Bonnie a minute, or?
So, I don't know if you're driving. Can you hear me? I don't know if you had a chance to look at this at all?
I did.
Okay. And, is the yield reasonable in terms of determining the cluster yield itself?
Yeah, the format that I generally look for on a yield plan is, number 1, the layout to show zoning compliance with all subtractions and areas that can't be included in development or lot area. 2, indicate the location of the road that is a viable road location, which includes the development of a road profile to show that road grading would work. Grading would work from the roads to the proposed development areas, and John has done that with his yield plan. He's shown that, in fact, with the road layout, which is very similar to their preferred plan, they could, in fact, get the 11 development lots per zoning. They have not provided a profile for the preferred plan, but I can tell you that the road is so similar that I am very confident that the grading and the road would work for the preferred plan in similar way.
So at this point, did you go through the proposal itself or just the yield?
We went through both.
Okay.
Went through both. I started with the 11 lot yield. I started with the resource analysis plan and the survey, which is the first sheet of the 3 set. Then I went into the 11 lot yield, and then we just had started to go through the 6 lot, I'll call it cluster.
Well, and I guess that would be my question is, since we're required for a subdivision to look at a traditional layout and a cluster layout, would this qualify as a cluster layout?
The one with the 6 you're referring to?
Yes.
Well, how much open space have you preserved at this point?
I believe we are a little over 2.25 acres
Or
out
what
of the 6.
Oh, out of the 6?
Yeah.
So you're close to the 50%, but not quite there?
Not quite there. I would say more like a third.
So you're asking, is this considered a cluster?
Would this be considered, right, would this satisfy our requirement for having reviewed a traditional layout and a cluster layout? Because if it hasn't, then it's almost a non-starter by code, right?
Right, well, I think the first is, have they proven they could do 11 homes? And if they've proven they can do 11 homes, then it becomes a matter of cluster, which requires a certain amount of open space be set aside, which I think is 50%, but I'm not sure if we can waive that.
And usually with the cluster, an applicant is proposing very often undersized lots or lots that don't meet normal front yard, side yard, rear yard setback. And he's asking for an endorsement of that in exchange for the preservation of important resources as identified in the subdivision regulations. This is not that in that sense. It is in some ways a conventional plan that is less than the maximum that they could achieve. It could be conceivably, although the applicant wants to have large lots and privacy, it could be reduced to smaller lots and free up more open space, but it is certainly a lot less development than could occur.
By right.
Yeah.
Is the applicant willing to put a no further subdivision on the cluster?
I could certainly ask him.
Okay.
It's just, the applicant wishes to have slightly larger lots. That's really what they're looking for.
And Bonnie's suggestion may be an adequate trade-off, that although they have not preserved assets in the sense that a cluster may, they have provided a far less intense development than is as of right. So if they're willing to limit that for all time in the future, no further subdivision, that might be a trade-off you consider.
So from my perspective, this is the first time the board members are seeing this. And so I think they still need an opportunity to look at the site. I think we're headed in the right direction, in general, because I think, if they could have gotten 11 lots and instead they're doing 6, that's a substantial reduction. I think the question is the layout and whether, is this the open space that makes sense, or is there some other configuration that might work? I know the applicant, these were part of pre-application meetings, and they really wanted this little park area in the middle. I just want to make sure that in terms of what ends up being clear cut, if anything, we're not opening up views, again, I think all of us have to determine, is this a layout that makes sense? By keeping this open in the middle, if they keep it open with a lot of trees, it's going to help buffer views in and of itself. Then they're talking about also including sort of a buffer around as well, which would help, again, with tree preservation, et cetera. But again, I think in fairness to the board, they need to weigh in on this layout.
Oh, yeah, that's why we're here.
Right.
What I tried to do is, our opinion, it's basically this property has some trees. There's nothing else that we saw, there's no streams, there's no, geological, there's nothing overly special here except for the trees. So unfortunately, the proposed road has to go, that first leg of road from Scunnamunk has to go where we have it,
Right.
only because that's our only frontage from Scunnamunk. And part of that is also an Orange and Rockland easement. That's why that triangular piece you see there is, we didn't use that because that's an Orange and Rockland easement. So we have to stay out of that. So that first 300 feet of road has got to pretty much stay where it is, unfortunately.
That's going to be a separate lot?
I had that as part of Lot 1, would own
Okay.
that triangular piece.
And are we doing a private road or a public road?
This has to be a town road because of the number of lots. So, just a couple side comments besides compliance with the
Yeah.
the yield compliance. I strongly believe that the highway superintendent would prefer this road layout rather than a cul-de-sac layout, just
Okay.
for ease of plowing and winter maintenance. So, the fact that they're developing this with a loop road and it having the need to become a town road, I think this is a preferable layout to the town highway superintendent for maintenance purposes. Some other issues that would affect this subdivision either way, as John indicated, they need to get access to sewer. So it's a non-starter unless they get the easement or other means to get to the county sewer.
So you're in the sewer district, though?
Yes.
Okay.
So they're going to have to pursue that. Looking at this layout of the preferred plan versus the yield plan, I note that the reserve stormwater facility areas are quite smaller. So I think they should take a hard look at that as well when they're developing the plan to ensure that they've got adequate room reserved so that they don't mislead anyone as to the ability to keep that center island area of the road, let's call it undisturbed. It may end up having to be used for stormwater or maybe another area. So they should double check that because on the yield plan, they show a much larger reservation for stormwater.
Quick question.
And just one last
yeah,
one, so I don't
sure.
forget, is the stormwater as shown on the preferred plan and other improvements do seem to encroach into the Orange and Rockland right-of-way. So, again, without Orange and Rockland's okay to construct those improvements in the right-of-way, the plan is kind of upset in
We've
its
had,
ability to be developed.
I've had many conversations with Orange and Rockland just because of the two-road situation that was going on. So at the end, they were okay with any proposed utilities in there, but obviously they want to see a final design and review.
And last but not least, we'll have to consult with the town attorney and town board as to how the stormwater facilities will be maintained. If this is going to be a drainage district, if it's going to be privately maintained, I just don't know what intent this town board has as far as maintenance of stormwater facilities. So all those items, all are on the table, and that John will need to get resolved because each of those in some way could impact the layout of the plan.
Now, there's a little triangular area at the entrance across from the stormwater facility. That's not shown as being an easement area. Is there a reason why?
Where?
The wedge going down on the right side of the road.
On lot 6. On this side?
Oh, yeah, because the easement ends.
That's where the easement's still?
The easement ends on the other side of the road.
Okay, so that's still Orange and Rockland
No,
easement?
Orange and Rockland's easement ends. It ends right here.
John, I think what she's
On the-
asking is
on
that
the other
Conservation.
side.
that could be a conservation easement as well.
Oh, this little piece?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it's just part of Lot 6. There's no-
Okay,
there's
yeah, there's no reason why it couldn't be right.
No, I think at the end though, when the road grading comes in.
It may end up being graded out.
Yeah. I mean, we could always put it as a conservation and, plant the street trees there or something. But I think you're great.
So I'm just going to open up to the board members to ask questions, what their thoughts are on this layout and anything.
So I'll go. Bonnie already stole my thunder about the private road. I thought this could be eligible for a private road, but I thought it was based on homes, not lots. But
Private roads, the maximum number of lots on a private road is 6, 2 of which need to have frontage on a public road.
Ah.
Here you have no lots with actual compliant frontage on a public road, so as a private road, this lot could only have 4 lots total. So as soon as they went over the 4, it triggers the requirement.
So it's 4.
4, and then you're allowed 2 additional lots maximum if they have frontage on a public road. So by virtue of the 6 requested lots, interior, it must be a town road.
Thank you for that. And water, this is proposed to be on well water?
Yes, wells.
What's the quality, or I guess the health of the well up there? How?
Well, that is something that, as we further this plan, we will go down that road. We'll drill a well, we'll pump test the well.
I was going to say, you have to do one
Yep.
test for the 6, or how many wells?
It's looking like, based on my conversations with Tom Cusack and the health department, that it'll be one well, most likely in the center, either lots 2 or 3. They will drill that well. They will pump test it for quantity and quality based on 6 lots.
Tom Cusack from Leggett Brashears
Yeah.
and representing the town.
I think there's been the town board has expressed a desire to change. I forget
Oh.
the name of who they wanted to use.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know who they want to use either. I don't know.
I
Is
have
that
not
something
been
you can do? Is that something you can look into yourself, or you prefer Tom
We
to?
would probably look to work with the town board to get a,
Tony mentioned.
Have a hydrogeologist.
Something, I don't remember the name.
I'm going to guess maybe did he say Jeff Fredericks? Lewis Bergeron Associates?
I don't remember.
it might be, we've worked with them quite a bit.
Okay. So
Okay.
just so you're aware.
Yeah, just only because of the technical workshop we were talking
Yeah,
about. Okay.
this was very recent, so.
Okay, yeah, all I said to Tom was at a 6-lot subdivision where it was, and he just said, it's gonna be one well based on, I think his cutoff was like 10 lots or something.
Is the 28-foot width for this, is that hard and fast? 'Cause
For
that-
road width,
Yeah,
I believe so. I don't
It
have
seems-
the code with me, but I believe it is 28-foot paved.
yeah, is that kind of wide for 6 homes, or, They still have to get a fire truck, I know, in and other
It's
things.
more than the minimum required by state code for fire access, but when the town board was considering the road specifications, you always consider parked vehicles and the ability
Okay.
still to get emergency vehicles
Correct.
up the road.
That's true. Were we proposing sidewalks? Or is it required? Or is that
I believe they're
optional?
waivable. I think they're optional. I can double
We
check.
weren't proposing any,
Okay, so just any curbs?
based on the town road spec, it was curved.
Okay.
I'd almost encourage sidewalks. This looks like, like a family area. Kids are gonna be out running around, playing around.
Yeah, I mean, if we could look at sidewalks, we just didn't want to make it, the applicant would, trust me, would most likely prefer a private road if he could. They were very adamant about that, but they're trying not to make it suburban, I'll say, or more urban. They want it less, more rural. So, I mean, it's up to if you would like to see some sidewalks, we could add them, but I think you were just adding more
Impervious.
pervious to.
Are curbs waivable or no? Or would
I
they
don't
need it
believe
for the
so.
storm water anyway?
Actually, the dream was to only have, maybe a 24-foot wide, paved road with grass swales on the sides and into your lots, rather than, the curb and the sidewalk and more of an urban look.
Well, maybe we could
I'll
take a
look
look
at
at
the
road
road
specs.
I
waiver
think the town
options.
highway superintendent has some authority on
Yeah.
waivers, not the planning board.
Yeah. But in the end, it's going to be up to the highway super whether he wants it or not. Only because if this is 6 and,
Well,
now, was this going to be seasonal? Not that we can count on it being seasonal, but they talked about it being maybe more seasonal, right? Or no?
Yes, but I think at the end they'll be up. They won't be here full time, but they'll be here throughout the year. So
Okay.
it won't be just the summer. So,
Right. So they may be here for other holidays, other times of
Like a
the year.
weekend getaway
Yes.
kind of thing.
Okay. Okay.
All the more reason to have a sidewalk.
they have to
Lisa,
shovel it.
Rich, any thoughts? No, not at this moment?
I had a question.
Okay.
I think it's lot 1. It's a lot bigger than all the other lots. Is that, it looks like where the home is going to be, is that going to be an extra oversized lot, or the back end of that lot, is that going to be?
Well, that's the back end of that lot is what we proposed for the conservation, so the
That's
hatch,
okay.
because that's where the majority of the existing trees were.
Okay.
And it just worked out that that lot was slightly larger than the others.
So is the owner of lot 1 going to own that conservation easement, or whatever you just
Yes.
called it?
Yes,
They will.
yes. They'll
Well,
own it, and it would be deed restricted.
right, they'll own the property, but it's going to be deed restricted. The deed will run to the town or to some kind of land trust. and someone will enforce and make sure that it's not used for any other purposes than what we say they can, which is probably going to remain open space.
And then what about the center? I mean, that's just
The cen-
babysitting the center.
Yeah, the same thing with the
Same.
center, it's owned by, I was trying to get all the conservation areas to be within Lot 1, except for obviously the one that runs along the rear of all the other lots. So Lot 1 would own the center as well, with the same restriction.
So you're going to do like one of
Yeah.
these?
Yep.
Okay.
Tax map Z.
Tax map Z, thank you.
I like that there's no home in the center. I think in the first one, there is a home.
Yeah, I agree.
Nice.
Yeah, could be a nice area for a little park area for them. Or just, actually, it's really open space. It's required to be open space by the conservation subdivision. So even though they can use it passively, it's really supposed to be, to the extent possible, remain undeveloped.
Okay, I think they had.
I know they had some thoughts,
Yeah, they wanted to put some sitting areas, some gazebos
Yeah.
out there, you know.
and that's going to be minimal changes,
there
so,
wasn't-
yeah. I don't think that was necessarily. Ultimately, we'll have to see deed restrictions, conservation easement, and what they want there
What's allowed and what's prohibited.
versus what we'll allow. And then I know we're going to want conservation markers to show the boundaries so that they don't encroach, just as for them to know where their limit is as far as where they can go.
I've done that in other towns.
And then as far as the homes themselves, how many levels will they be? Will they have a basement?
Yeah, right now, we're actually working on the specific footprints, so we can incorporate those into the plan. But yes, right now they're designed to have basements, first floor, second floor.
Okay.
Is it mostly meadowy or was it mostly forested? The site. I'm trying to remember.
The perimeter is mostly, the tree line perimeter, and then inside was mostly meadow.
Meadow area?
Yeah.
Because I think we might want to add, so this is future, but add some street trees.
Yeah, you'll get that with around the road, and
Right.
then, depending on what they want to do with the center, we may have, a planting plan for the center.
And then if, for whatever reason, we have to grade into any of the areas that we're contemplating as, like this triangular area in the front, we may want additional plantings in there, if it's conservation easement
Okay.
area, once it's graded out.
Okay.
Although I don't know what your slope's going to be or, what's going to be required.
Yeah, once we get into this is the path we're going down, then we can start doing the detailed engineering for it, and then we're going to see that. But based on the yield plan, I know that triangular piece in the front will have grades going across it.
Okay.
And over here, is there going to be a stormwater facility on the easement?
Rich, talking to the, thank you.
I see over here, it says a proposed stormwater facility. Is that going to be on the easement?
Within the easement, yes. Yes, no, those are the conversations we've had with Orange and Rockland already.
All right.
So would we need something from Orange and Rockland?
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. Seeker, did we get an EAF or did we,
Yes,
have we
I
seen
did
that
that.
already?
I did a short form.
You did the short form? Was this the one that had archaeological on it?
Yes, it triggered, the action is located in a sensitive area.
Did you, have you started anything or otherwise we're going to start it?
We
As-
did.
Okay.
But
Consultation?
We did, yes, and I have to redo it to add Noreen onto it,
Okay,
so I'll do that
okay,
in the Chris system.
okay. I think at this point, we could declare ourselves, this is an unlisted action, right?
Yes.
So we can declare ourselves lead agency. We don't have to conduct coordinated review, but we can. What other agencies are involved? We have the health department.
With the Health Department for Water, we have
Sewer
the
District.
Orange County Sewer District, and the DEC.
And the DEC. I would make a motion that we declare this an unlisted action, but that we conduct coordinated review, since there are multiple agencies involved, which will start the coordination process. And I think we'll send the map, because we have to send something. We'll send this one, but again, it's subject to refinement. So that's my motion, if anyone wants to second it.
I'll second it.
Okay. Noreen, can you do a roll call vote?
Yes. Lisa McQuaid,
Aye.
Rich Triano,
Aye.
Jason Zorinsky,
Aye.
Jeff Manson,
Aye.
Bonnie Franson.
Aye.
We have Anthony Vaccaro is absent, and Jim McKnight is absent.
Correct. So we can start the seeker process.
Okay, great.
Can I just ask, in what you anticipate to be the conservation area, do you have a sense of what percentage of the sizable trees will be preserved by that? Because it looks
In the conservation
considerably
area?
more than the traditional, well, we'll call the original. In the conservation area, it looks like there's a lot of the sizable trees. It looks like you tried to, with the exception of like where the road is.
That's right, yeah, that's why.
I'm just curious if you have an idea of what percentage of those trees would
Well, I'd
be
like
saved.
I'd like to try to save them all.
Are these all the
on-
trees?
What's that?
Just real quick, are these all the trees over a certain diameter, or these
Yes.
are the ones you're preserving? They're
No,
all,
these are all the
Okay.
trees over 8-inch diameter.
okay.
That's why I brought the conservation area down with that leg. You kind of see on lot number 1, where that cluster of trees is, and then it turns. I'm going to try to stay away from there and not affect that at all. And in the back, we won't affect. And then the tricky part will be when we turn the corner to go along the rear. I would like to keep those up on top, and that's what we have to work out with the lot grades. Once we get a final building footprint, we'll start to incorporate that.
And I guess I'd just like to say that, I would prefer that there not be sidewalks. I'm going to have to disagree with Jason on this one. Living in a similar kind of layout, traffic is going to be minimal here. And I think actually it sort of lends, my road is very walkable. We have no sidewalks, no curbs, and a lot of people pass between, from house to house and up and down the street. So that'd be my preference, that we've less, more permeable space.
So I think we need to hear from Mark just what can and can't be waived, what we have to go to the highway super. I tend to like rural. I tend to like less impervious myself. I appreciate the sidewalk comment because I think it makes sense, depending on circumstances in the lot and the project. But for this one, given the limited number of dwellings, frankly, I'd like to see curbs gone. I'd like to see swales. I like to see rural. But again, there's only, we have our standards, so.
And maybe the highway superintendent would be inclined, if he has the authority to grant those waivers, provided that this stayed a 6-lot subdivision and was not developed to the full 11-lot potential in the future, and that's something that John will explore with his clients.
Yeah, I'd like to see, even if it's in the public right-of-way, I'd like to try, I don't know what the requirements are for clearing out the 50 feet, or if you can keep trees or
I'll
keep
speak with
things.
John, and one of the items that I'm sure John would add to this, because there are only these houses that are served, is a dead end and no outlet sign, so that you wouldn't have cars mistakenly go up the road believing they can get somewhere. So that would even further limit traffic up into this area. So I'll speak with John, John and John Cherney as well.
It'll be a good conversation.
Yes, we'll work on those goals.
Anybody, other thoughts on the sidewalks? Any strong feelings, or you kind of want to just check out the site first before you think about it? Or make a decision?
I'm leaning against the sidewalks.
No, the sidewalks don't matter to me. It doesn't even seem like, you mentioned we should go check it out. I don't know if the road is even there. Like, how are we going to see this site?
Well, there's an existing driveway.
Oh, there is?
Yeah, and
Right.
there's an existing residential house, so you can drive up to the dwelling, which is basically right in the center of the property.
If you look at where the number 10 is on the road, 1000,
the
that's
house.
sitting right over the house. You can see it very faintly made out. So you can, is anyone inhabiting the house right now?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, so we should let them know before we.
Let me know, and I'll let the
Don't do
the
that
applicant know.
midnight.
No.
Might not be good.
That's when I was going.
Sorry. In addition to starting seeker, is there anything else? I know you have to review this. We all have to review this. Is there any other referrals or things we need to do?
Does this require a county planning approval? Is it within 500 feet of any
I
trigger?
believe it's within 500 foot of the village boundary,
Yes.
so it requires a Village of Monroe referral with county planning as well.
I guess my sense is we need a little bit more engineering, a little more grading, before we send up. But only because if it I don't think it's gonna change dramatically, but if it does, then we have to send it
It
back.
seems to me that there's enough questions here that if some of the design solutions can be determined and we can get some feedback from the highway super, John could update the plan, and that would probably be a better plan to to circulate
Okay.
for all purposes.
I think probably one of the items we need to check sooner than later is the hydrogeologist, so you can touch base with them.
Yeah,
And you're going to have to do your well testing, you're going to have to consult with Orange County anyway.
Yes, and we already, we did pull a well permit with the town, with the building department, so we are setting up for that, so.
okay.
It's just a matter of, I guess if the town is.
How many and what are the parameters of the testing?
Correct, and whoever the
Okay.
hydrogeologist will be.
Okay, so
I can
I'll,
always work with the health department, but they'll only take it so far at this point.
Right.
Because, I would need a preliminary approval
right.
for them to officially act.
So I'll reach out to the town board and find out specifically who it is and then get them on board so you can talk to them,
All right,
give you the contact information.
All right, perfect. And then I'll just ask, so generally, this layout is okay with, we're gonna have some, we'll have some changes, tweaks, but overall, it's,
I think my only question was, could you put more of the road in the right of way or you can't? And maybe it doesn't make sense for from a grade perspective.
put.
I didn't know if that would just save more contiguous area, but then you're still gonna need the stormwater basin and, I don't know. I was just wondering whether you could run it along what's already disturbed anyway. Because it's easement area. But I don't know if O&R will let you do that.
No, they will not.
They won't, for sure.
Orange and Rock will not allow a road within
Okay.
their easement. That's like a no-go for them.
Okay, okay, understood.
Yeah.
So, I think we just need to make sure the EAF is in order, before it's sent out. And, the EAF is based on the 6 lots?
Yes.
Okay, and then, so Mark can take a look at that, and then if everything's in order, we can start our notice of intent process.
Okay.
And then, we'll go from there.
All right.
We'll need, obviously more details and the grading as we go out, but,
Yeah, I'll
Did you want to
coordinate.
schedule a site visit now, or you want to wait until the foundation plans are more detailed?
no, we probably should do that sooner. I'm wondering if they should
Nice
be on
time
the
of year.
next agenda too, you think? Does that make sense? Oh, no, that's too soon.
Well, I think first that Mark and I should coordinate with the highway superintendent because that's going to drive
Yeah.
a lot of the design.
Okay.
Because if I don't have curbs, then drainage swales make a completely different, stormwater design and sizing of systems. So that would really be what I want to get accomplished first, and we can do
Okay.
the sidewalk as well.
Right.
Because
Maybe before the next meeting, since we have to be here anyway on Tuesday. I don't know what your schedule's like. Our next meeting's Tuesday, right?
Yes,
that's the
17th.
17th.
So maybe like at 6:15, that would give us a half hour, possibly, or how's people's schedules?
I can do
For
that.
what?
I would not be able to attend. I'm sitting on a train.
Okay, so we were talking about 6:15, maybe before the next Tuesday meeting, to go out all together and take a look at the site.
I can do that.
You could do that? Rich, you available, or you don't think so? Well, we could do two separate site visits, because Jim will also need to go, you'll need to go, Rich can go, so maybe we'll do 2.
Do you want anything marked in the field, and does John have time to get that done?
I was just going to say, do you want to wait at least for everybody to do it all at once rather than pieces, or?
We can wait,
Because also.
because it sounds like there's other things that have to be done,
Well,
so
do you
maybe
want,
for the
like
next
Mike
meeting.
was saying, do you want anything staked out?
You're right.
I think we should wait a
could do
little
that.
bit till we have a more concrete design.
Okay. And people can still go if you really want to look, just with advance notice, but we want to go together, then we'll wait. We'll get you a date,
I was
a
going
date.
to say, could we get the date so I can, because I'll stake out the center line of the road for you, so at least you have a reference.
So maybe let's say by the next month's meeting, Thursday? Maybe are you still on a train?
I'll have a bit more notice and can coordinate
Possibly,
my schedule a
okay.
bit more.
So maybe we'll try and do it before our
Okay.
next month's Thursday meeting.
which is August 9th,
August 9th? Okay.
yes.
Yeah, and I think that should give us
Oh, you
enough time.
can't
Yeah, it's the one meeting I should probably miss all year.
Are you going to be away?
Yeah.
You on vacation?
Yeah.
Okay. What
I hope
about the
to be in Can- I
Tuesday?
hope to be in Canada on the 9th of
Well,
August.
What
tell you
about the
this,
Tuesday?
we'll,
Are you
um,
back by
August
Tuesday, the next one?
21st is
Yeah.
the following.
Yep.
Okay. August 21st?
More time, the more time I have to schedule.
Okay.
I don't want to push it that far out, because then if you have any comments or changes, then I'm not getting into that till September then.
Is it August? When's the Tuesday meeting?
The Tuesday is August, the first meeting is August 9th,
Yeah.
and then the regular meeting is August 21st.
And so
Because
just for the way it
The way the
fell,
calendar fell with the
okay.
first and the third and the third.
You know, we're gonna I'll pull the board, not here,
Okay.
but we'll come up with a date that's before then that
Okay.
everybody can make.
Perfect. Because
and then
by the
we'll-
time I know, it'll be September.
Yeah, no, we'll try and do something earlier, but,
And in the meantime, I will just have the road staked for you. And
Okay.
I'll send you a map with the stake location so that if you happen to go out on your own, they'll be there.
Okay.
You'll be able to navigate.
Ward, did we send this to Ward already in the, we were going to send a set of plans? Where were we gonna set, so they could do a sidewalk? I'm not sure.
I gave it to John.
You gave it to John?
I think that was
Do
his
you
name.
have the plans for this?
Not aware of it.
Okay, because we wanted you all to look at the trees and go out on the site and see what could be preserved. So I think we sent them to John.
He came in and picked up.
So John Ebert picked up the plans. So at your next meeting, if you could coordinate to maybe get out there, take a look at the trees, and just give us your perspective on the property.
Or you
Okay?
can have my copy here if you want. I have another one in the office.
Were the tree species noted or just diameter?
Just diameter.
Diameter, okay.
Actually, no species.
Okay. So their plan has the species and the trees and diameter, so, make sure we didn't miss any.
Yeah, the very first sheet. Yep.
Okay. Any other questions you have of us?
No, I'll coordinate with Mark, the highway superintendent, and like I said, I think that's going to drive the whole thing.
Okay. Yeah, let us know what he wants, what he's flexible on, and then we can discuss it and go from there.
Yep, and then, just let me know the date that you decide for the walk.
Okay. And then make sure to add Noreen for the Archeo.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now we'll just provide with the. I know. Bond France.
Vodka didn't come,
They didn't come,
They didn't show up.
so we're really up to,
Lanzaliva?
yeah.
Okay.
We just have to go to bond. These are all the emails that Mark found on different things regarding this.
So these were all from your files?
I'm sure there's a lot more in the file, but that's what I was able to gather this afternoon.
Let's not move, let's just move.
Yeah,
Thank
sorry
you.
about that. Okay.
Come on up.
Good evening. My name is Richard Krogan. I'm the attorney for Lanzaliva. And Mr. Leva is here present as well.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Welcome.
Good evening.
Thank you for adding us to the agenda on such short notice.
So tell us where you are. I think this has to do with, is it release of the bond?
Yeah, it goes back several years, but the most recent activity was in June and July of last year. The project is, in effect, a two-phase subdivision. The applicant had constructed at the end of the Phase 1 section a temporary cul-de-sac and was seeking dedication of Phase 1, release of bonds, and acceptance by the town of the dedications for the road and for a stormwater basin located in Phase 1, I believe on the left side of the roadway as you go in. Back in July, I had forwarded to the town board and to the town attorney a recommendation that, in fact, based on a field review of June 9th by our office, multiple conversations between our office, Mr. Leva's engineer, field visits with representatives of the town highway department, we all felt that the Phase 1 improvements were in acceptable condition, could be dedicated, could be accepted, and the bond could be released and a maintenance bond could be accepted. In fact, now the performance bond has actually been in place now for what would probably be the maintenance period. So I would suggest that this board make a recommendation to the town board that the bond be released. I don't see, in my personal opinion, any need for a maintenance bond, because my understanding is the town's been plowing the road. They've been out there, they had checked to make sure that the temporary cul-de-sac was large enough for the larger vehicles that service that area of the town. So I believe it was just a procedural delay in getting the bond released. I
So-
think it's in good shape.
For phase one, is the cul-de-sac to here at this point? Or doesn't go all the way out, or it does?
In
Or
the
it goes here.
multitude of attachments from all the emails I was able to get my hands on this afternoon, there is an as-built that shows the temporary cul-de-sac. It was prepared by Peter, Zach, and Fow. I'm flipping through trying to find it.
Is it this first one here?
It might be.
Familiar?
I'm just
It
trying
says
to,
as-built on it.
yeah.
Looks like this, guys. It's right after,
That's the cover sheet for the subdivision, but there is actually an as-built prepared by Peter, Zach, and Fow, and the Levers were kind enough to even make, I believe, the temporary cul-de-sac larger than what was originally requested, just so that it could handle the larger plow trucks. So, again, it's relative to Phase 1. I'm not aware of any reason why the town could not move forward on the recommendation from last June and July. Yeah.
Just for further clarification, the road was dedicated in the bargain and sale deed of June 16, 2016, that's recorded. I think it's just the retention pond that was inadvertently left off, and that's what we're asking.
And the bond is still in
Yes.
place as
and the
well.
bond.
I'm
So the
confused
reten-
myself as to why the planning board has involvement here, but if the town board wants your endorsement and blessing, I would suggest you do so. I'll talk to Brian Nugent after to see whether this is going to be a universal procedure or is this just an unusual one? Because normally, once the project leaves the planning board, you don't even see the construction. There wouldn't be
Yeah.
any ability for you to make an intelligent decision as to whether a bond should be released. That's usually the
Unless there's-
town engineer or the inspector
Yeah.
that's been hired and the town board. But,
Unless there's something unique to our code that there's some sign
yeah,
off.
I was
don't
wondering
know.
whether there's a change in the code that requires it.
Yeah, and
But
it may be in
if the
subdivision
town board wants your
regulations.
endorsement, based upon Mark's report, I recommend that you give that endorsement and communicate it to the town board.
So, and again, just to be clear, because we're talking about the drainage basin, that is in a drainage district? And is that town-owned?
It must be if it's
they're
going to be given to the town.
bonds, right?
yeah.
But has that been dedicated, or that needs to be dedicated?
That needs to be dedicated.
Okay.
And we-
I'm sure it was offered, but it hasn't been accepted, is what I gather.
Yeah, I believe, with Mr. Sweeney was the attorney originally of record, and he had prepared a Schedule C, but inadvertently was left off the dedication.
Okay.
So I had prepared a letter April 18th, 2016 to the town of Monroe, and at that point, the now deceased supervisor, Mr. Harley Doles, and the members of the board. And since April 18th of 2016, no action has occurred on this.
Okay.
Sounds like it's ripe.
Yes.
So, Mike, what kind of resolution would you suggest we?
Actually, I guess Tony gave one.
You see where I just drew that
No,
purple
Noreen.
arrow? Okay. That's what he wants read in.
Okay. So I will read this resolution into the record, and then if I could have a first and a second. Be it resolved that the planning board of the town of Monroe hereby approves the return of the performance bond to Paul Leva from Leva subdivision and the dedication of the detention pond to the town, with final approval to be given by the town board of the town of Monroe at their next scheduled meeting on August 13th, 2018. May I have a motion
I'll make the motion.
and a second?
A second for discussion.
Okay.
It's the town, are we recommending that town board? Or did because I didn't hear recommend, I heard town board is given it.
That the planning board of the town of Monroe hereby approves the return of the performance bond and the dedication of the detention pond to the town, with final approval to be given by the town board of the town of Monroe. I mean, we don't really approve the dedication of,
Okay, I'm with Mike. I'm not sure what we're doing here, but
so,
But in the interest of fairness to the applicant that's been waiting for 2 years, I don't think any harm is done by voting on the resolution that the town board asked you to vote on. And then let's find out in the future
what the
why we're
process-
following this practice.
agreed.
My question, we don't know why we're doing this and why the town board isn't doing this.
Well,
I
at
think
least
they
it says it's
are. I think
subject
they're
to
just
final.
asking us to do it.
But we don't know why they're asking us. Right?
I
Is
don't
that
know,
right, Mike?
and I agree with you, Rich. I'm a little confused as to why. But I don't want to see the applicant lose another month after all that's going on.
They've been at this
And
for 2
really,
years.
it's also, the resolution itself said it's subject to final action by the town board. I would say go with it, but let me, in the meantime, find out, because I'm confused. Maybe there's something in the new code that I'm not familiar with that requires this.
I know.
I don't know.
I think it might be in a performance bond section of the subdivision regulations, or,
I
but
don't believe so, but
I don't recall this.
I think Mike's right that that resolution acknowledges that there's a subsequent step that the town board must act. So if we can get it off the table, we'll clean it up for the next time.
Okay.
You want to do a roll call vote?
Jason,
Aye.
Lisa,
Aye.
Rich,
Aye.
Bonnie,
Aye.
Jeff,
Aye.
Anthony, and James are out.
So the motion, the resolution passes 5-0, 2 absent, and is that it?
Yes,
think
thank
we're
you so
good.
much.
You're very
Greatly
welcome.
appreciate it.
Sure thing.
Now, I have it down as Paul Leva.
Yes, Paul's my father.
Okay, I just
Yeah.
wanted to make sure, was that the right
Yeah.
name?
That
Because
is-
that's
that
what
is
is
the
in
right
the
name.
computer right now.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Have a good
You're
evening.
welcome.
Thank you.
Good night.
You've asked me to give you a
Training session?
training session. I'm prepared to do so. The question that we had earlier is, do you want this to be recorded or not? It's not part of your normal meeting, but...
What is the subject matter?
I thought I'd give you a background on a few things. The legislative basis of the zoning power. It's a little late in the evening to be talking about such an exciting topic. Constitutional limits, and then kind of an outline of the roles of the various boards, planning board, zoning board, and if there's time, get into a little bit more of the constitutional implications of the zoning power and what's in vogue in terms of legal challenges, because that might be helpful. We'll see how deep we get into that.
I have no problem continuing to record, because there will be people in the public watching, and maybe they may learn something. So it's fine with me, unless,
Do you want me to move there, or is it okay here, or how do you want to do it? I
You-
do have I will need to borrow your HDMI.
okay, so you have a
line
PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay.
there. What works better for you, George?
Yeah, that's, but you want me to film what you're putting up on the screen, correct?
I think it might make sense to film the PowerPoint
Yeah.
rather than Mike talking.
No, I didn't.
And I guess the second question is Mike's educated me a lot on this already.
Do you need to be here?
Yes, you can go home.
have to
You can
stand.
go home, Mark.
Mark is dismissed.
And before we start, could we have a 5-minute break?
Absolutely.
Sure, why not?
We can set ourselves up.
Okay. I told you briefly what I was going to lecture about. It does sound dry and unexciting, but but it may lack in excitement for you. Will be made up in its importance, I think. And since I'm fascinated by the law of zoning and its constitutional limits and legislative basis, I hope maybe I'll pass some of that excitement on to you. To be fascinated or even understand the law of zoning, I think you need to start at the beginning. We all are in the middle. We accept zoning. We accept that government can tell people what they can do with their property. What I'd like to do at the beginning is to question that notion and ask you to question that notion. You don't have to reject it. If we did, we'd all go home immediately. But I want you to question the authority of government to tell people what they can do with their property. I want you to question it in the sense of its origin and context and how we were born as a nation. Our nation, this is a libertarian rant, I guess, for a moment, it was born of distrust in government. our Constitution's primary thrust is the protection of individual liberty against governmental intrusion. Thus, when an issue arises pitting individual liberty and the rights of a person against the common good, individual liberty is the presumptive winner, and government must do backflips to justify the righteousness of its efforts on behalf of the common good. Remember our nation's great constitutional debate. There's a quote here from Samuel O'Brien's Sentinel Essays that ran in the Philadelphia Press in 1787 at the height of the Federalist debate over the adoption of the United States Constitution. I'll read it. Universal experience demonstrates the necessity of the most express declarations and restrictions upon the power to govern, to protect the rights and liberties of mankind from this is powerful language, the silent, powerful, and ever-active conspiracy of those that govern. I don't think there's any stronger expression of the crucible in which our nation was born. And from James Winthrop's Agrippa essay in the Massachusetts Gazette during the same debate, it is therefore necessary to defend an individual against the majority in a republic as against a king in a monarchy. So our two fears were the power of government, its evil core power, and the power of the mob. We are not a democracy, and we did not, quite intentionally, we did not want to be a democracy, because if you think about it, in a democracy, if the majority of people say that anyone who's Jewish or black or Italian must leave the country, majority rules. That's a democracy. We are not that. We are a constitutional republic, and we have a very different form of government than democracy. I think the law of zoning must be understood and must always be viewed in this constitutional rights context. Now, before I turn to the details of the legislative basis of the zoning power, which I think is the major thrust here, let me give you in 4 sentences the totality of the law of zoning. I will then try to break these 4 sentences apart, and that will lead into the legislative basis of zoning. Here it is. I call it Donnelly verses 1 to 4. Verse 1, one has the right to do as he wishes with his property. Government may, however, place limited restrictions on that right, provided that those restrictions are justified by protection of the general health, safety, and welfare of its citizens, and provided further that such restrictions do not so unduly interfere with an individual's property rights as to deny him reasonable use of his property. Next, unreasonable or unjustified interference with an individual's property rights may constitute a governmental taking of property, entitling a property owner to just compensation. And finally, local land use boards have only that power to regulate use of land granted to them by state law, what we call enabling legislation, and exercised by those municipalities and those local boards through their local zoning laws. We call that implementing legislation. Wasn't that simple? Let me repeat it and put a little bit more meat on that as we go. One has the right to do as he wishes with his property. This is the pursuit of happiness referred to in the Declaration of Independence. It is regarded in our constitutional jurisprudence as a fundamental right under the Constitution, often called a constitutional right, and I will call it most times here this evening the property right, which is a very amorphous concept, but it is that pursuit of happiness idea. Government may, however, place restrictions on that right to protect the general safety, health, and welfare of citizens, and provide further that such restrictions do not so unduly interfere with an individual's property rights as to deny him reasonable use of his property. We are all guaranteed the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We all as individuals have those rights. Government has no rights. Government certainly has power. Sometimes it actually has the authority to exercise that power, but government has no rights, and it only has the authority and power given to it by we the people. While it is not explicitly spelled out in the Constitution, the courts have declared that government has the authority to enact zoning laws. Nothing in the Constitution that says that. Believe it or not, the governmental authority comes from the authority that is in the Constitution called the police power. There is no inherent authority to zone at either the federal, the state, or the local level. The authority to zone comes from the police power, which is the power the Constitution gives to government to protect the general safety, health, and welfare. This is the same authority that allows government to enact criminal laws, the same authority that allows police officers to arrest or to search or to seize. As such, it is always suspect. Realize also that zoning is fairly new. It really began in the 1920s. It replaces and overlaps the common law of restrictive covenants and nuisance, which have been around since ancient English common law. Let me explain briefly the law governing restrictive covenants and nuisance, because there's some parts of it that still remain important and viable. A restrictive covenant is a concept in real property law that allows the grantor or seller of property to place limitations on its use. A conveys to B, provided that B shall not allow the property to be used as a brothel or a bawdy house. Or today, A conveys to B, provided that B shall not allow above-ground swimming pools or clotheslines or something of the kind. Restrictive covenants are binding and enforceable. For centuries, they were the only way land use could be limited. There are some limitations on things that may interfere with restrictive covenants that prohibit the sale to a black person or things of the kind, but they're really exceptions. Generally, restrictive covenants are, in fact, enforceable. Nuisance is also a concept in real property law that's been with us for a long time. Nuisance existed initially, and still does serve this purpose, as a private right of redress. However, the later developed doctrine of public nuisance can be considered, I think, the direct precursor to the law of zoning. Under the law of private nuisance, a property owner who uses his property in such a way as to directly and adversely affect his neighbor is answerable and damaged. Thus, manure from a farm leaching into a stream or well and poisoning drinking water, dust or soot from a factory settling upon a residence causing ill health to those within, and the artificial collecting and piping of surface water onto adjoining lands causing flooding are all examples of nuisance. An untastefully constructed building or the operation of a business in a neighborhood long entirely residential do not constitute nuisance and would never have been actionable at law. Not only can one sue for damages under a nuisance theory, that is, an award of money for the damage that was caused by the nuisance, but one can also seek an injunction preventing or mandatorily remediating that nuisance as well. When the nuisance is such to affect the community as a whole, and not just a handful of neighboring property owners, a public nuisance is created, and the sovereign in the United States, a state or its political subdivisions like counties, cities, villages, and towns, is authorized to seek an injunction or to sue for damages caused to the community as a whole. That's the doctrine of public nuisance. The doctrines of public and private nuisance are still very much alive and exist totally separate from zoning law. Verse 3 again. Unreasonable or unjustified interference with an individual's property rights may constitute a governmental taking of property, entitling a property owner to just compensation. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, contained within the Bill of Rights, not part of the original Constitution, guarantees protection of the individual constitutional level property right, and it affords a financial remedy for its violation by the government. That's called just compensation. Lastly, local land use boards have only that power to regulate use of land granted to them by state law, enabling legislation and exercised by them through their local zoning laws implementing legislation. These two generic pieces, enabling and implementing legislation, constitute the legislative basis of the zoning law. Each is important. I will outline some of New York's enabling legislation, but I really think it would be helpful for each of you in due course, because we have a new zoning chapter anyway, to read through it, get a handle on what powers you are given and the outline of the discretion that you are given to exercise those powers. State law enables you, a planning board, to do certain things in the zoning context. A municipality may have chosen to exercise the powers that the state has enabled, but to do so, it must have affirmatively implemented those powers. Let me give you an example, and I think it's the best example. There's a state statute called in the General Municipal Law called Section 96A, entitled Protection of Historical Places, Buildings, and something else, but I don't know what it is because it's left off there. And works of art, I'm sorry, it appeared here. Let me read it to you. It'll give you the flavor of a well-drafted enabling statute. In addition to any power or authority of a municipal corporation, and the town is considered a municipal corporation, to regulate by planning or zoning laws and regulations, the governing board or local legislative body, here the town board, of any county, city, town, or village is empowered to provide by regulations, special conditions, and restrictions for the protection, enhancement, perpetuation, and use of places, district sites, building structures, works of art, and other objects having a special character or special historical or aesthetic interest or value. This would include historical preservation, architectural review authority, and the like. Such regulations, special conditions, and restrictions may include appropriate and reasonable control of the use or appearance of neighboring private property within public view, and I stress the importance of that because it's not a legitimate exercise of power to worry about private view sheds, only public ones. In any such instance, excuse me, such measures, if adopted in the exercise of the police power, shall be reasonable and appropriate to the purpose, or, if constituting a taking of private property, shall provide for due compensation, which may include the limitation or remission of taxes. The legislation does not by itself give the planning board authority to tell a property owner who wants to tear down an old historic farmhouse in order to lay out a new subdivision that he must preserve that farmhouse because it has historical value. Before that can be done, the municipality must implement the dormant authority that the state has enabled by adopting legislation identifying, creating, and protecting an historic preservation district. Note also how this enabling legislation touches on my 4-sentence summary of the law of zoning. It recognizes the property right. The statute enables only appropriate and reasonable control. It references exercise of the police power. And it warns that too broad an implementation may constitute a taking of private property, requiring in such case that the local regulation shall provide for due compensation. Thus, while state enabling legislation can be thought of as generic, it is reasonably consistent across municipalities in New York, in the city law, town law, and village law, and generally easily learned because it's broad stroke. Implementing legislation is unique to each municipality. Not all municipalities in New York have fully implemented the zoning powers that the state has enabled them to enact. And it's important to recognize that. It's not enough that it's in the state enabling law. It must be in your implementing one as well. Let me tell you a quick story about that because I remind you it's helpful to know your code and your subdivision regulations. I was before a planning board on behalf of a client seeking subdivision approval. In the midst of a loud public hearing, a member of the neighborhood was opposed to my client's project, addressed the planning board, and read beautiful language from papers he held in his hand. His address touched upon providing for the future growth and development of the town, affording adequate facilities for the housing, transportation, distribution, comfort, convenience, safety, health, and welfare of his population, and other such lofty concerns. When he was finished his eloquent address, a planning board member, who I was sure was favorably inclined toward my client, asked in rather curt, impatient fashion, "What on earth is that nonsense you were reading?" To which the speaker replied, "The introductory section to your subdivision regulations." Learn your codes. Let me run through some of the general enabling statutes that are important in the land use arena. And let's start with the planning board. Local legislative bodies of cities, towns, and villages may create planning boards. The legislative body is the elected town board, village board, or city board. A municipality is not required to have a planning board. Indeed, it's not required to have zoning laws at all, and there are still municipalities in New York that don't have zoning laws and don't have planning boards. The enabling statutes authorize municipal legislative bodies to provide for the referral of any municipal matter to the planning board for its review and report prior to final action. Generally, that means site plan subdivisions and special permits, but really anything that has to do with land use can be crafted through the enabling legislation to give the planning board authority for review. Thus, while the functions of a planning board may extend beyond land use, generally, land use is the limitation of the planning board's authority. Many local zoning laws establish a procedure for referral to a local planning board of all applications for rezoning or remapping. Such planning board reports and recommendations are often of vital importance in deciding these matters. Until our most recent comprehensive plan and zoning rewrite here, Monroe had not often utilized the planning board or sought the planning board's input on zoning changes. And I say that with some degree of disappointment. We certainly did in this last round. And I, on your behalf, wrote certain reports, and we had the advantage of Bonnie being involved in the process before she came here. But I think there was some definite cooperation, and the planning board was well utilized. I can't say that that has always been the case in Monroe. Comprehensive planning. Comprehensive planning logically forms the basis of all efforts by the community to guide the development of its natural and man-made environment. Town Law 266 requires, at the initial formation of a zoning law, the creation of a zoning commission to recommend the boundaries of the various original districts and appropriate regulations to enforce those. Excuse me. Town Law 270 authorizes the creation of an official map. That map depicts in that part of the town outside the limit of any villages or streets, highways, parks that have been or will in the future be laid out and to be established by law. Such map should be final inclusive with respect to the location of streets, etc. There use of magic language. Such official map is hereby declared to be established to conserve and protect the public health, safety, and general welfare. All throughout the enabling statutes, we come back to that. A comprehensive plan is defined as the materials, written and or graphic, including but not limited to maps, charts, studies, resolutions, reports, and other descriptive materials that identify the goals, objectives, principles, guidelines, policies, standards, devices, and instruments for the immediate and long-range protection, enhancement, growth, and development of the municipality. The vision for the town is the comprehensive plan. From it flows the drill-down rules of your zoning chapter and your subdivision regulations. The county also has a role to play in planning, and we've seen this under the general municipal law provisions that all start with 239. You will see that these all begin with 239 and have letters behind it like a skipping record. These sections go through the alphabet. And we're now up to, I think, NN. We're going through the alphabet the second time. You would think, thank you, Bonnie. You would think that the legislature would have simply continued sequentially with numbers. And pondering why they did not, I'm reminded of a joke my father used to tell. I'll tell it to you quickly. I can't do the Irish brogue as well as him, but Mrs. McGillicuddy, a home economics teacher in the New York City school system, was teaching her class how to prepare baked beans. And I assume these things were really done back in my father's day. He was born in 1915. You take a pot, fill it halfway with water, and to it you carefully add 239 beans. Place the pot on the stove and bring it to a boil. A student, confronted as we are tonight with the mystery of why you would stop there, asked the obvious question. Mrs. McGillicuddy, why 239 beans? To which Mrs. McGillicuddy responded, oh, that's simple, because if you added just one more, it'd be too farty. Hence, the all-important 239 alphabet of the general municipal law. Orange County, as you know, has a planning department created under 239 of the general municipal law. Certain matters are required to be referred there. We've seen it. There are triggers within 500 feet of certain things. The idea is for the county, who is more broadly focused than you might be, to bring to your attention intermunicipal concerns, how this may impact the larger community, a neighboring town, a state highway, the county's long-range plan, park system, a trail system, and to bring those things to your attention that you might not have recognized because you're too focused, presumably is the thought in the statute, to recognize those matter. It is important, and it's important for two reasons. One is it's considered by the courts to be jurisdictional, and the failure to send something to the county planning department when it is required to be referred means that you have no jurisdiction to act, and any approval you give is void. Secondly, it changes if the county makes a recommendation against the approval. It changes your voting requirements. It goes from a majority to a majority plus one. Here, from 5 to 6 votes, on a smaller board from 3 to 4. So it becomes a very important section. The enabling statutes, returning to what they are and looking at that has to do with site plan. There is a section of the town law, 274A, I think is the current numbering system. It has changed over time. Gives the authority to municipalities to grant authority to their planning boards to review and approve site plans. Site plan review, as you know, is concerned with how a particular parcel is developed. Site plan shows the arrangement, layout, and design of a proposed use of a single parcel. It may be multiple tax maps, but one overall site. Site plan review can include both small and large-scale proposals, ranging from gasoline service stations, drive-in facilities, office buildings, complex shopping centers, apartment complexes, industrial parks, etc. Site plan review can be used as a regulatory proceeding standing alone, but it may often be in connection with other needed approvals, such as subdivisions or special permits. The authority to require site plan review is derived from the state enabling statutes. Subdivisions, as you know, is also something you're given authority to review. Subdivision is typically thought of as a division of land into separate building lots, which are to be sold to individual buyers. But subdivision provisions can also apply to simple division of land offered as a gift or lot line changes for some other reason. Not surprisingly, it depends upon how your local zoning law defines it. There is no definition of a subdivision in state law, at least other than the generic one, cutting land into pieces. Your own code defines it. And if you say that putting two parcels together is a subdivision, then it requires subdivision approval. If you say moving a lot line, even though you had 2 lots before and you have 2 lots after, that's a subdivision, then it's a subdivision and it needs subdivision approval. We have a carve-out here in Monroe that says that a lot line change that does not, and there's a string of preconditions, doesn't make a non-conforming, doesn't make a lot non-conforming, doesn't, whatever those triggers are, that can be reviewed on a procedure of less formality, meaning it wouldn't necessarily require a public hearing and as many steps as subdivision review would. But it's all up to you, and you're implementing legislation as to how you want to define it. When I say you, I mean the town. Special use permits are also something that towns and cities and villages may incorporate into their zoning law. Often special use permits are not well understood.
Quick question on the subdivision enabling legislation. So with subdivision regulations and the process, is that one area where, because we haven't talked about the fact that you can, through, I guess, municipal home rule law, supersede certain sections of these enabling statutes, but with subdivision, we actually have to live with those procedures, or can those be superseded? I thought they couldn't be.
First, a little bit about supersedence.
Okay.
It's one of the most complicated areas of the law, and it ties into a doctrine called preemption. And yes, you have the municipal home rule law that gives you authority to do certain things. However, it starts at the federal level. When the federal government does something within its sphere, and they're supposed to have limited authority, but they've grabbed a lot more authority than they were supposed to have under the Constitution, they may preempt a field and say that no one below them in that pyramid has authority to enact laws. Often they say, we enact this law, but you states have to enforce it, like the Clean Water Act and other things that we see in the land use context. Then we have the same concept at the state level. And though we have the municipal home rule law, and you are given authority to supersede, In some cases, you don't have the authority to supersede if the state has preempted the field, and it can happen in one or two ways. Either the state passes a law that explicitly states that it intends to preempt the field, and it hereby prohibits anyone from changing or superseding that law. Or, and here's the rub, if it enacts a comprehensive regulatory scheme that evinces an intent to preempt the field. That's where I get lost. Because what we're talking about here is a comprehensive regulatory scheme that seems to suggest that the field is preempted. Now and then the issue pops up. About 20 years ago, the legislature changed the area variance standard. It used to be an undue hardship. They replaced it with a 5-factor balancing. Some municipalities said, yeah, we liked undue hardship. We're going to rewrite our code to now supersede your 5-factor test and replace it with our undue hardship that we're used to and had a long history. It was challenged, and the highest court, the Court of Appeals, declared that the section that gave the authority to zoning boards to grant area variances was an expression of a comprehensive regulatory scheme that evinced an intent to supersede the field. So municipalities couldn't change that standard. They were bound to follow it. I don't think it's any different in the subdivision context. The subdivision authority, however, is much less specific. One of the issues that's changed in site plan, and I'll take subdivision first, let me back up. We had subdivision enabling statutes a long time ago. In 1977, SECRA was enacted. We used to have a whole lot of time periods in the subdivision enabling statute. And if planning boards didn't do certain things within certain time periods, the time periods were different, they were much shorter. They were like, you had 45 days from submission of a subdivision application to approve it. If you did not, you were deemed to have approved it by default. Well, what happened is SECRA came along, and SECRA says, if you issue a positive declaration, then you have to have a public hearing, and you have all these stacked up time periods. It was absolutely impossible to achieve what the subdivision enabling statute said you needed to do before you would have been deemed to approve a project by default. So a developer, I think it was down on Long Island, the case was the matter of Sun Beach, he waited for the 45 days while the planning board was working on SECRA and scoping and whatnot. And when the 46th day came, he went into the town clerk, and this is how the statute used to read, and said, give him my certificate of default approval. Here's my date stamp subdivision application. This is the 46th day. Sign it. And there was a lawsuit when the clerk didn't. And the case went up to the Appellate Division Second Department, which is the intermediate appellate court that governs this part of the state. And the court said, how do we figure this out? And it said, when we have these conflicting time periods, we have to mesh them somehow. And the idea was that the court declared that because SECRA was of greater importance than subdivision review, that the clock was deemed to be stopped the moment the positive declaration was issued. And whatever number of days were left when the findings, the SECRA findings, were issued, would be the time period before default approval. They were dealing with something that they had to come up with a solution. Since that time, the statute, took many years, has now been codified. That finding is codified. And if you look through the subdivision sections of the state enabling statute, 274, 5, 6 in there, it goes on for pages, and it lays out a decision tree. If a subdivision comes before you and if you give a negative declaration, then this happens. If a positive declaration, this, when the public hearing has to be held, how the time limits work in conjunction with SECRA. And it has dovetailed the SECRA regulations into the statute. You cannot, because that is a comprehensive regulatory scheme, supersede that. But other provisions in terms of what you can do, what is a subdivision, whether it's a lot line change or something else, I think there's not any evincing of an intent to lay down the line that you can't cross. So, like I say, supersedence authority and municipal home rule law things are difficult, but I think there are some things you can do, some things you can't. But I think subdivision regulations actually are often of a lesser level of formality. They're often regulations and not laws. It has much less importance than it did years ago, but you see them often as an appendix rather than part of the code and whatnot. But I don't think the limits are in substance any different. Special permits. One of the misnomers about a special permit, and I thank Bonnie for the way in which she's approached the rewrite, is that somehow a special permit is an animal that's very different than site plan. It is not very different than site plan. When the town board says that there are uses permitted in a given zone, subject to site plan approval, there has been a determination made legislatively that the planning board is not free to second guess that those uses are appropriate in that area, end of story. Your job then becomes to make sure they comply, that there's good planning, that the environmental impacts have been mitigated, etc. Special permits are a little different. There, the zoning rules tell you that certain uses are only permitted, specially permitted, if in addition to the general requirements of the zoning chapter, certain specific criteria that relate to each of those specific uses are also met, and you make findings to that effect. They must be located on a state highway, on a parcel of a certain size. And Bonnie has laid out in your code a number of special uses and all of the criteria that apply to them. And we have actually had a handful of these, and I've tried to track what those findings are and what you need to make. However, once those findings are satisfied and the criteria are met, there is no difference between a site plan approval and a special permit approval. It is not special in the sense that you have a different authority and you can tell somebody no, etc. It's just for their individual criteria tailored to specific uses that sit on top of the general requirements. And once they're met, then it's the same as a site plan. Let me talk for a moment about the distribution of the zoning authority among the various boards, and this chart tries to lay that out. The planning board isn't the be-all, end-all. In the first column, we had the legislative authority. That's the comprehensive plan, the zoning chapter, road specifications, and those things all fall into the lap of the elected officials, the legislative body here in Monroe, the town board. We then have the administrative arm, which is the planning board. You implement the code that has been written by the town board. You review site plans, subdivision, special permits. This includes the planning board. It may also have, if it's a separate entity, it's not. It's the same here, an architectural board. We then have a permitting body, the building inspector, and they generally also have enforcement authority. And lastly, we have an appellate body, the Zoning Board of Appeals, and they handle individual appeals, and they are the final arbiter or the body that interprets the meaning of the code when it is in doubt. I think it's important that you understand somewhat of what their authority is, even though you're not a zoning board. Zoning boards of appeal are a basic part of zoning administration. Matter of fact, if you have zoning law, well, you don't have to have a planning board. You must have a zoning board of appeals. You cannot do without a zoning board if you have a zoning law. Zoning boards serve as a safety valve. There's a recognition in state law that it is not possible to write a zoning law that covers every possible situation, every piece of land, every unique circumstance. Therefore, there has to be a safety valve that enables somebody to give a little bit of flexibility and vary the requirements, grant a variance, from the bulk table requirements of the zoning law. That's the Zoning Board of Appeals authority when it comes to area variances. There's also a recognition that in some cases, the use authorization provisions of a zoning law might to a unique individual property mean that that property can't be developed. That use, although announced as appropriate for that area, simply cannot be carried out on that property. And if that's the only use that's allowed on that property, and the owner can't carry it out, then the government has effectively taken that property. And rather than say, okay, we'll have a law that says that, and the town board writes the check, instead we say, let's have the zoning board be given use variance authority. So in those unique cases, if the impact of the zoning law would be to take property, they can grant a use variance and allow something else to occur. It becomes a safety valve to prevent takings. On top of area variances and use variances, the two middle circles that I just outlined, the zoning board has, as I mentioned before, the authority to interpret what the language of the zoning chapter means. They don't have authority, unless the town board in a given municipality has given it to them, to interpret the meaning of the subdivision regulations or the building permit article. It's the zoning authority. Now, the town board can say, and our zoning board has the authority to interpret anything in this code, but that would rarely be done. But they have the final word on what the zoning law means. And if the town board doesn't like it, they have to live with it or amend it. But they can't say the zoning board is wrong and we say, here's what it means. It's like the courts in our system of government. The legislative body is like Congress, the town board. They enact laws. Administrative agencies and the executive branch are the parts that are like the planning board and the building department. And then lastly, we have the appellate body, the zoning board of appeals. There is criteria for area variances, and there's a definition of area variance. It's here on the screen, and it's the authorization by the zoning board of appeals for the use of land in a manner which is not allowed by the dimensional or physical requirements of the applicable zoning regulations. And while that sounds simple, it is not always that simple. What is dimensional or physical requirements?
I was going to bring this up.
All right. I'll give you an example because I had one.
Because are there circumstances where, like a special use permit, some of the conditions, they're not really dimensional or physical, and they're not really use. And if someone doesn't meet it, can they really get relief from an area or seek an area and use variance?
Well, I think I'm hearing you talk about two different things. You're talking about the conditions of the special use permit or the conditions that are attached to an approval granting a special use permit?
Well, no, actually, some standards. So, for example, and maybe this is a bad example, but let's say, for example, a special use says you are required to submit a traffic study. That's not really a physical or dimensional requirement, and it's not really a use issue. So let's say a developer says, I'm not submitting a traffic study. And the planning board, who has the authority to waive special permit standards, says, we want one. Now, he can't go off or can he go off to the ZBA and say, I don't want to do a traffic study, because it's not quite...
You got several interesting questions in there. I'll try to remember them as I answer. Let me first go to the physical and dimensional, because I think it's a poor choice of language and it doesn't really help. But I represented a client one time. He owned a farm over in the town of Hamptonburg. He had an old barn in the back of the farm, and over the years, I think it was even perhaps someone before him, had converted that barn into an apartment, and he went merrily along his way and had rented it out. He went to refinance, and his banks will do to you. They say, show me a certificate of occupancy for that secondary structure in the property. So he goes to see the building inspector and asks for a CO, and he says, what do you mean? You got an apartment in the barn? You can't do that. That's a second single-family home, and this is a single-family home district. And I said, well, he came to see me to see if I could help him out. I said, well, I think we got to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals, and I think we need to convince them that this is an area variance, because the use is a single-family home. We're carrying out the use that's allowed. We're just going to do two of them, and that's dimensional. Therefore, it's an area variance. funny part is, the zoning board agreed with me, and I had a hard time initially saying it with a straight face until I spent more time doing research. That is an area variance. And what the courts have begun to say when they see case after case of these, and this gets sliced in many different ways, is they kind of ignore the language and simply say this: unless the variance being requested relates to the, in the most narrow sense, the use, single-family home, factory, apartment building, that everything else that relates to it is an area variance.
Oh, okay.
So if it relates to how the use is carried out, it's an area variance. Now, the third issue you raised is when a planning board is given waiver authority and it declines to exercise it, may that applicant appeal to the zoning board? Because what they're appealing really is something that is within your jurisdiction. And while codes can be written to grant that second layer, I'd say without specific language, I don't think they have standing or the zoning board has authority to do that. I simply think that
From
once
the
waiver
special
authority is
permit
given,
standard specifically.
or even site plan,
Okay.
you know,
Okay.
for instance, many codes, I forget if our new chapter does, because I must confess I'm not fully up to speed on it. Many of them have the authority given to the planning board to waive some of the required elements of the submission, like topo or structures within 100 feet of the boundaries. And an applicant comes in and says, listen, I got a 40-acre lot here, I'm only looking to do this little thing. Do I have to do topo for 40 acres, and do I have to show every house that's within 50 feet of the outer dimensions of my 40-acre piece of land? Planning board says, we insist you show us that. And he says, I just can't live with that. I want to go to the zoning board and get a variance. If the planning board was given waiver authority, I'm not convinced that the zoning board has the authority to grant a variance for that, unless the town board wants to write that as a second level. I've not researched it thoroughly, but somehow that's what my gut tells me. I will tell you, and I've had some litigation over this, there are some municipalities in this county, most notably Tuxedo Park, the village of Cornwall on Hudson, where Mark sits on the village board, that allow appeals of decisions of the planning board to the zoning board. So if you deny a site plan before you go to court on Article 78, you can appeal to the zoning board and get a second bite at the apple. And the question is that a do-over, or is that a challenge like on an arbitrary, capricious basis like would happen in the Article 78 context? And it's somewhat unusual, but you can give the zoning board all kinds of authority, and the implementing legislation allows it.
It was funny because this argument has come up before, and again, I guess because I don't know how much case law there is on it, I've heard attorneys argue, no, you can't appeal a planning board decision because it's not in the enabling legislation.
I don't think you can.
You know, but
Unless-
then again,
unless
it's not in the enabling legislation. You know, sometimes.
But the enabling legislation also says that you can give to zoning boards, I didn't have that piece here, such other authority as to the town board may seem appropriate.
Okay.
So you can, for instance,
So I can make the
zoning
argument
boards
then.
can be given special permit authority.
Right.
I always cringe when municipalities do it, because special permit authority is so different than variance jurisdiction that they start thinking in terms of 5 factors and balancing, and what does this do to the character of the surrounding neighborhood? And they cannot change gears and stop acting like an appellate court and start acting like an administrative agency charged with implementing the zoning law. But zoning boards can be given all kinds of authority. But if they're simply given the authority to grant area variances, I don't believe that means they can second-guess planning board decisions, either in the final analysis or along the way. There are 5 factors under the current state law that the zoning board must look at before they can grant an area variance. And this is a change from what the law had been years ago that required undue hardship. The applicant used to have to show the zoning board that he suffered some hardship as a result. No longer. I call this the I want method. He simply says, here is my goal. I want something that the code won't allow me to do in the dimensional sense. And the zoning board then hears from him, holds a public hearing because it's required, may hear from the building inspector, because often it's he that said, no, you can't do that. And then they look at these 5 factors and balance, in the big picture, the impact on the surrounding neighborhood against the goals and objectives that the applicant wants to achieve. They must look, will this cause an undesirable detriment to the surrounding neighborhood? Is there a need for this variance? And if there's a need, and they decide to grant a variance, they should grant no more than what is required to meet that need. Are there environmental effects? Often these are type 2 actions, so I should have put the E in environmental and effects as a small e, because many, probably 90% of variance applications are type 2 and exempt from secret, but you still get a junior opportunity to look at environmental impacts. How substantial is the requested variance? And lastly, was it self-created? Bad choice of words. What that generally means is, did I buy the property with the zoning restriction in place? If I did, I'm charged with knowledge of it, and my need for the variance is self-created. If the ordinance or the zoning chapter or the provision that I want to have varied was enacted after I bought the property, then it wasn't self-created. No single factor is determinative, and they are a tool, a method of balancing the applicant's desire or goal against the potential detriment to the community. By far the most important is whether there's undesirable detriment to the surrounding community. Use variance is the authorization by a zoning board for the use of land for a purpose which is not otherwise allowed. The standard here is very different. There is a very strong burden placed on an applicant for a use variance. He must meet each of these 4 criteria. The failure to satisfy any one of the 4 means he may not receive a use variance. The first is the financial impacts. There must be an economic hardship. The applicant must demonstrate by dollars and cents proof, which generally means something like an expert accounting or economic analysis. Rarely real estate brokers on value. It takes something more sophisticated. And what you have to show is this. You look at every use that is allowed in the zoning district where I am, and for each, you perform an economic analysis. I bought the property for this. To convert it to that use will cost me that. That total brings my investment to X number of dollars. A reasonable return on my investment in the current time period is 2%, 5%, 8%, whatever it is. What I can charge to rent someone to operate that thing that's allowed would achieve this, therefore I'm not, and it's less than that, I'm not getting a reasonable return on my investment. You would have to do that analysis for each and every one of the uses that are allowed in that district, and each of them you'd have to demonstrate will not return a reasonable return. And then you say, but the thing I want to do is a win. I'm going to make 28% of my investment. That's the first factor. You have to demonstrate that by hard dollars and cents proof. It's very difficult to achieve and rarely successful. Secondly, it must be unique, and it must be tied to the property, not the owner, and not the neighborhood or district. If, in fact, every property in a given neighborhood or district is suffering the same financial hardship, that suggests the need for the legislative body to rewrite the zoning law. We've seen this to some extent in the black dirt areas of this county. As farming has become more and more difficult, more and more farmers are saying, I need a use variance. I want to have a truck repair depot or this, that, or the other thing. You got to show that yours is the only property that suffers that hardship and that it's unique to you that you need to have that depot. Otherwise, they should be petitioning the town board to enable other uses in that larger neighborhood or district. The third criteria is very much like the undue detriment in the area variance context, and it's neighborhood character. The zoning board must look at whether this alters neighborhood character. It has to be preserved. And if necessary, the zoning board has authority to impose conditions as a means of maintaining that neighborhood character. And finally, self-created. If the hardship is self-created, meaning I bought the property with the zoning in place, then I am not entitled to an area variance, to a use variance. It's an absolute bar. Now, the reason that is in the statute is that was the law, constitutionally speaking, at the time they wrote the statute. So said the Supreme Court. However, it's not the law anymore. The U.S. Supreme Court said in Palazzolo, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, that having an absolute bar based upon the regulatory scheme is a windfall to evil, now we're talking Winthrop's essays, to evil government purposes. Because once they change it and somebody sells the property, wow, the municipality is off the hook. And that's not fair. What we should look at instead is reasonable investment-backed expectations, a much looser standard. Now, if we have time, I'll talk more about that later on. Interpretations, ancillary to its authority to grant area and use variances. The zoning board has the authority to interpret the zoning chapter. Not anybody can walk in, that's standing, and say, you know what, I was reading this chapter last night and I'm confused. What does this mean? I'd like you to interpret this for me. No, you have to have standing. It has to be a real controversy. It has to impact you or your property. And it has to be, in most cases, if it's a private citizen, tied to a variance application or to an appeal from a building inspector determination. One of the things you can do, if the building inspector says, I read the code as saying ABC, so you can't do the thing you want to do, you don't have to ask for a variance. You can say, no, I want the zoning board to reverse the building inspector's determination because I think he's reading it wrongly, and if you interpret the way I said it should be, then I should be able to do what I want to do.
So let's say that with the planning board, someone comes in front of us and we say, and I'm thinking of a Romero, for example, you know, what does the law say and what's required? We can't refer them. They have to go back to the building inspector, or they don't have to be referred directly?
There's kind of a rub. You may only appeal a decision, order, determination, a whole bunch of nouns they stick in a string, of the code, of the official charged with enforcement of the zoning chapter or something of the kind, the building inspector. You cannot appeal a planning board decision to the zoning board, even one that says here's what the code means. That's why, generally speaking, I have said to you, and we had this give and take when Bonnie was rewriting the code, that the gatekeeper should be the building inspector. Only the building inspector can say this use may or may not be carried out in a particular zoning district. Only the building inspector realistically can say you don't meet side yard setback, although that's so mathematical anyone can. So you used to always need to get a denial letter or disapproval from the building inspector. There was a recognition some years back that that's such a convoluted process, and some municipalities would say, oh, if you had an application pending before a planning board, you'd have to withdraw it to go back to the building inspector to ask for an opinion and then appeal it, then file it anew. They amended the law to say that when an applicant is before a planning board seeking subdivision, site plan, or special permit approval, and it becomes apparent to everyone that a variance is needed, that applicant, doesn't even say referral, that applicant may go directly to the zoning board without the need of appealing from a decision of the building inspector. And when he goes directly, the zoning board is permitted to ask the planning board to report to it on that issue. The way that is generally implemented, and I think it's a better way, I wish the statute was written this way, is what we do, and that's a ZBA referral. The applicant doesn't really go himself, we send him there, usually with his agreement that that's the best way to do it. And if you are, rather than wait, because the waiting will take the zoning board to ask you to do something, and then you meeting again to tell them what it is, I usually recommend that if there are certain issues you want to bring to the attention of the zoning board that fall within your jurisdiction, you should include that in the referral letter. I do not believe that the referral letter should be a recommendation of thumbs up or thumbs down. That is stepping on the jurisdiction of the zoning board. I do think it helpful that if you have particular concerns that they should know about that may affect how they decide, thumbs up or thumbs down, you should bring those to that zoning board's attention.
It's interesting, there's one, in the subdivision regulations, it actually has a provision that says the planning board shall recommend to the ZBA if someone's seeking a variance from a subdivision.
And we've given the zoning board authority under the subdivision regulations to grant variances. I'd have to look at it and see.
Yeah, we came across it.
Yeah.
So in Shawangum, we make sure that there's a recommendation that goes off to the ZBA because of the enabling legislation.
Yeah.
Saying something about shall, not even a should, if I recall correctly. I have to look at it.
All right. While we're on the topic, because I think this is also an important concept, when, and let's stay with area variances, when a zoning board of appeals grants an area variance, so let's make it simple, it's side yard setback. We have a bulk table that says you have to have a 50-foot side yard setback. They grant a variance that says you can have 15 feet. All that means is the bulk table for this application is different. It does not mean that the planning board has to allow construction within 15 feet of the side yard line. It simply means the bulk table says that's the closest you can get. Give you an example. An applicant says he wants to build an office building. He doesn't like the 50-foot setback. He goes to the zoning board and gets a variance for 15 feet. But you look at it and you say, well, wait a second, this office building is going to have 3 floors and 6 different offices. And he wants to put a driveway on the same side where he just got a 15-foot setback variance. 15 feet isn't wide enough for a driveway with all that parking that's going to be needed. And there's a house next door, and we think there should be some plantings there so the headlights aren't shining in the windows of the people's home when people go to visit their dentist, accountant, lawyers don't work at night, so doctor in the evening. We're not going to let you build your building that close. You're going to have to make enough room for a 2-lane driveway and the plantings. He doesn't have a right. It's just the bulk table changed. You still have your authority to require that things are well implemented and it meets the objective of the zoning code.
Even after they've gotten a variance?
Yeah, that's my view. I don't think that just because, and that's why this coordination is good, because what you might want to report when that goes that direction is we have a concern that the building cannot be located within 15 feet of the line, given the house, the need for plantings, the fact that we need 2 lanes for traffic because of the number of people that are going to be coming in and out, the stacking problems that may cause on the street. Please factor these concerns into what detriment to the neighborhood, etc. I mean, that would be helpful to the zoning board. Saying you guys would be crazy to grant it is not helpful to the zoning board, all right? One of the things about interpretations is trying to understand the intent of the code. And that means what the words mean, not necessarily what somebody in the town board said they meant when they wrote it back then or what they say it should mean. But once they've done that, it also leads to consistency so that we all know what the code means. And the zoning board's interpretation is supreme. And nobody can second guess it. Not the planning board, not the town board. Town board, of course, can change it if they want. I don't know how long you want to go on tonight. I'm going to do a real quick thing on secret. Just what's that?
I just said that it's been an hour.
How long do you think it takes for secret?
I could go on forever.
I know, that's big.
You'd have a few people snoring, maybe.
Yeah. Why
We
don't maybe leave it here, and then we'll do another session where
Yeah.
we start with seeker, because seeker can be an hour, at least.
Could easily be. I was really going to give it once over lightly here, and we'll save it for another time.
Yeah.
What I did want to get to, but I don't want to get to at 9:30 or 10 o'clock tonight, is a
Yeah.
little bit more on the constitutional limits, because that's when I really get excited.
Okay.
So if you want, we can stop here and we'll pick it up another time when the agenda is light. But what I wanted to stress is there is a scheme, there is a fabric, there is both a constitutional and a statutory dimension. There's enabling legislation, implementing legislation. Your authority isn't absolute, but a lot of these things, are intended to work together. And I think it's important to see how they work together and understand what your authority is. I think planning, I represent a lot of clients, and I represent town boards, and I represent zoning boards. Planning boards are the best. I think that's where the rubber hits the road. It really is an important way to implement the vision that the community has put into place. Where planning boards go astray at times is when they think their vision is what the community wants, not the vision that is announced in the comprehensive plan and the meat put on the bones in the zoning chapter. And often, when there are Article 78 proceedings, there are two leading causes of losing those. Number one, that always leads the list every year when you do a survey of successful Article 78s, is giving in to community pressure. You have a job. Your job is to do the right thing based upon the zoning chapter and what you see. When you start counting the number of people that spoke against it and give in to community pressure, when there's no evidence that, that it's just complaints, that will lead to problems. The other is simply ignoring your code or making some kind of absurd statement about what is allowed and is not allowed. And that generally comes from planning board members that have not spent any time looking at their code. You're all in a unique position, except for Bonnie, that we are not that familiar. We might have been familiar with the code that existed before. We're all in the learning process. And it may be helpful, like people do with the Bible, to read a little bit of it each night and get an idea and see how, when a particular issue arises, look at that section a little bit more thoroughly and see how it drills down. We're always going to find, no matter how well written the code is, and I think we've done a good job, that there are going to be ways that it's hard to figure out how it applies to this. That may require an interpretation. It may require patchwork amendments to codes. Often that happens. It seems to me in the U.S. Supreme Court, about 60 to 70% of their docket in recent years has been trying to figure out what a really poorly written congressional statute means. And that's a disgrace. Their world is more complicated. They work under tighter, more difficult deadlines. They have political pressures and compromises that they need to reach, but often their laws are so poorly written that the Supreme Court spends much too much time trying to figure out what they're about. And of course, a lot of what they do is to defer everything to administrative agencies that then promulgate rules. New York doesn't do a lot of that, but the environmental conservation law is a good example. If you look at the environmental conservation law, it's pretty short. There's not a whole lot in there. But they've given to the Department of Environmental Conservation the authority to promulgate rules and regulations to implement that statute. The SECRA, it's not a law, it's a series of regulations that have been promulgated by the DEC. So it's not even our elected officials that write a lot of the meats and bones of the laws that govern us. Here at the town level, it is. The buck stops at the town board. They are involved in the comprehensive plan. They write the zoning chapter. It might be helpful to them from time to time, as we had collected some things that Bonnie implemented, when things don't work, that they seem counterproductive, that they're frustrating, that they're unfair to citizens of the town, make recommendations for change.
Right.
But until those recommendations are honored, it's not your role to just ignore the code and say, well, that's what it says, but that's not the way we do it. That's not a proper approach.
When it was adopted, it was a real overhaul of zoning, and we said, expect to look at potential amendments after a year, because then we will have had the opportunity to work with it, and you start to see if there are any glitches or anything that has to be, even with Romero. There were a lot of 1 acre lots that are 40,000 square feet, and the new requirement is 43,560, plus you have to exempt, or you have to deduct environmental constraints still from minimum lot area. So should that stand, or should there perhaps, because that's unique to the one-family zones, maybe be reconsidered? So that's something we have to maybe make a recommendation at some point, yet the law is the law. It says what it says now.
Should it be the same for allowance of a single-family home on a substandard lot, or should there be a heightened requirement for an accessory apartment where it must meet the full requirement? And I think, Bonnie, you and I agree that language explicitly says it has to meet the scheduled district
Right,
regulations.
and that's that.
Not the old step-down table, which doesn't even exist any longer.
Right, so so they do have to get their variances. You know, there's a balancing of, I know for certain, the town board did not want everyone to have an accessory apartment.
Right, sure.
You know, they wanted them to be truly accessory, and where it made sense.
Lots of
and
adequate size.
and where there was, you know, conforming lots, et cetera. This is a little bit of a, you know, it's a nuance because of the fact that we changed 40,000 to 43,560. So, you know, something to consider, but at this point in time, the law is the law, you know, and variances are needed.
Apropos, since you bring Romero up, and I did send you all that email correspondence, and I wasn't at your meeting, is there a feeling or an understanding on your part that this building, this house, does not meet the 10-year requirement? Because I cannot figure it out from, it looks like there had been a house there, that it burned down, that this was a replacement house, and there may well have been a continuous use for a 10-year period of that property as a single-family home, and I thought, though I wasn't here, that that's the conclusion you reached at the June meeting, and that's why you didn't instruct me to send it for a variance from that requirement.
His affidavit says
Well, his
yes.
affidavit clearly says it's been continuously
So I
used.
Right.
spoke with David.
Nemetko?
Thank you. I'm like, I'm not going to attempt his poor last
And I'm sure I said that wrong.
today, because he needs to get the public hearing out for the ZBA.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And he asked me, and I said, well, one of the questions that has come up again is your 10 years. And I said, your applicant signed off that he has lived in this.
Well, not that he lived, but it was used, yeah.
But it was used. Did somebody live in there for 10 years? Because his CO is 2016. And he said, I will 100% go back and double check this with the owner. But he read everything before he initialed it, so he knew what he was initialing. I said, okay, because the board is questioning that. So he said he would definitely double check, but now he's working on his stuff for the ZBA tonight.
But I have a question
Yeah.
about that. How do we hang our hat on that affidavit? When the affidavit says in number 3 that there's been no changes to the property since the CO was granted. In my understanding, if I'm understanding correctly in the story, after the addition was put on, after the CO was granted, then the accessory apartment was built.
Well, it hasn't been built yet.
Oh, is that?
Where
No,
we have-
he's asking for it.
No, which is the one, is Romero the one that they have the pre-existing, that they're trying to sell it?
That's,
Or who's that?
Country Court.
That's Country Court, is that Romero?
Okay, then I'm
Okay.
mixing two
Yeah,
different
Romero-
situations.
Romero,
All right.
the property goes back to 1950 or something, if
Okay.
I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And either the house burned down or it was knocked down.
I was
I've
told it
heard
was
two
a
different
fire, yeah.
versions, whether it was burnt down or knocked
Yeah.
down. They rebuilt it on the same footprint as the 1950 footprint.
Mm-hmm.
But now it comes into effect, has it been used for 10 years? When it went before the ZBA, one of the members brought up, why is it before us if they have a CO with the variances not even mentioned? Because it has a side, a front, and a back. No, it has a lot area, a side and a front, I believe.
Yeah, they don't have an accessory apartment yet. on that
No,
one.
they
Okay.
need to build one
Yeah.
in the basement for
Right.
the sister.
Right,
Okay.
Right.
niece Or something
Right, all
like
right,
that.
that's out.
right. So,
So that's the email trail that's out there that I
Okay.
made
So I'm
one
mixing two
statement.
The question is, do you want me to send any kind of follow-up correspondence or referral to the zoning board, or is that email correspondence, which has been copied to their members, adequate to lay out the land,
well, I
the
think,
lay of the land?
you know, the law is they have to be inhabiting it for 10 years. You know, a fire, you know, that wasn't their, you know, whoever's doing, you know, they had to rebuild. They may have not been able to live there until it was rebuilt. You know, I think it'd be useful maybe for the ZBA to weigh in, because to me, that's a little different than someone just not you know, the building didn't exist, or, you know.
Well, I can
There
send
was
them a note that
something
says,
there, like,
if
there was-
necessary.
I think we just need more detail, you know, because, you know, these are each of these accessory apartment laws or apartment applications are turning out to be unique in and of themselves with their own particular
Yeah.
circumstances. But I think we need more information on the occupancy. But I also, you know, this is just my feeling, is that if the occupancy was discontinued for a period because of the fact there was a fire and they couldn't inhabit it, I feel a little differently about that. But we have to make sure we're still within what the zoning allows, and maybe the ZBA can weigh in on that.
Just so we don't lose, because recognize that if the zoning board acts on the dimensional variances first, the side yard and the lot area, and then the guy comes back here, and then we say, no, we think you need a 10-year. I mean, he's been here 4 times already. 4 times. And he's been at the zoning board once, he's gonna have to go to the zoning board again. We're gonna play more leapfrogging.
Yeah.
Do we just wanna send I'll do it at your direction, a note to the zoning board that please consider a 10-year if necessary?
Yeah.
So that,
And
let
leave
them
it-
make
leave
the
it over
factual
there.
findings about it.
Yeah, and I would leave it over there.
Okay. I'll
Because
send them
he's
that
there
note.
now, instead of him having to come back
Yeah,
and then
that's
go
what I mean.
back, yeah.
All right, I'll drop a note
but
over there.
board members okay with that?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for staying awake.
Thank you, it was great.
Oh, we have to stay here all night.
All in favor?
Aye.
Somebody second? Who, Jeff?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm like, oh, man.